Hello, and welcome to your first day of COM 412, Gender and Communication. For a variety of different reasons, I'm not going to be able to be in class for our first 5 meetings, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook. Rather than coming into class on our first 5 regularly scheduled days, you will be completing these days in the comfort and luxury of your own home, online. So we're going to have online lectures. You're going to be completing activities where sometimes I'll ask you to watch a YouTube lecture and apply concepts from the reading and lecture to interpret the communication, the gendered communication you witnessed in the clip. And it's going to be important that you complete all of these activities before we meet in class for the first time, which is scheduled for, I believe, September 20th. Because on September 20th, when we do in fact meet for the first time in person, I'll ask you to just pass forward all of the work that you've done up until that point, and it will be graded. If you don't have the work completed on September 20th, you won't receive credit for it. But we'll discuss the finer points of the syllabus a little later. What I want to do is what I would normally do with any class on the first day of COM 412. And I want you to consider some of the themes that we're going to be exploring all semester. So we're going to define some words. There are 3 terms that I want you to write down on a sheet of paper and then define. These terms are gender, sex, and sexuality. And by sex, I don't mean the act of sex, but I mean sex in noun form. So what I want you to do is press pause and come up with a definition. Well, listen to the instructions first before you press pause. Come up with a definition, a distinct definition for each of these 3 terms. And I would prefer that your definitions take full sentence form. But if you're really struggling with 1 or 2 of the definitions, it's okay if you want to just write down some terms that you might associate with this term. After you construct a definition of each of these terms, I want you to pull a real or describe a real-world example, a specific real-world example that illustrates why the term matters in our culture today. And what I mean by a specific real-world example, I don't want you to say in regards to gender that boys do this or girls do this. I want you to name a specific person, like Hillary Clinton, or Sarah Palin, or David Letterman. You know, if you go with a celebrity, that would be good because more people will be able to relate. You know, it's somebody who everybody knows. But if you also want to talk about maybe one of your family members, that would be okay too. So at this point, press pause and give us a definition of each of these 3 terms, and also write down a real-life example of why these terms matter today. And when you're done with that, press play again, and we'll continue. Okay, so the 3 terms that I asked you to define are gender, sex, and sexuality. And I want to give you some basic distinctions between these 3 terms because a lot of times in public discourse, these terms are sometimes used synonymously. People often confuse them for one another, and they are 3 distinct concepts. So what distinguishes between gender and sexuality is gender is a social construct. It's a cultural construct. Our notion of gender is not natural or stable. It changes from culture to culture, and it also changes over different periods of time. And that's one of the ways that we know that it is, in fact, a cultural construct. So what may be the normative organization of gender in our culture may be radically different if we go and study a more tribal culture. Let's say like Aborigine populations. So when we discuss gender, we're not talking about the things that are relatively stable from culture to culture. We're talking about gendered expectations, or in other words, how people perform masculinity, femininity, and androgyny. And we'll discuss these concepts throughout the entire course of the semester. So the big thing to take away here is social construction, masculinity, and femininity. Now, sex, on the other hand, although there are several gender theorists who we'll discuss throughout the semester who also argue that several aspects or components of sex are also social constructs, but by and large, sex refers to biological characteristics that remain relatively stable from culture to culture. So when we're talking about sex, we're not talking about masculinity or femininity. We're talking about male versus female. What makes us male or female? Well, things like our sex organs, hormones, chromosomes, all of these biological factors that contribute to our sexual identity, being male or female. So some key terms that you really want to associate with this term sex equals biology, chromosomes, hormones, male and female. So the big distinction between gender and sex here is that gender you would associate with masculinity and femininity, sex, male or female, or intersexed for that matter. And then the third term that I ask you to define is sexuality. Sexuality refers to our impulses, our desires, who we are sexually attracted to, also who we engage in sexual behaviors with, regardless of whether or not that fits in with who we're attracted to. And also, so sex acts and also our sexual identity, whether we identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. So sexuality is very complex, and definitely our gendered expectations help shape and form our notions of appropriate performances of sexuality, but gender does not determine our sexuality, or else we wouldn't have gay and lesbian people around. So we're going to spend the rest of the semester discussing the concepts of gender, sex, and sexuality, and this just gives you a little preview. We'll also be discussing these three concepts in regards to other, what I call, differences that make a difference. Things like social class, ethnicity, race, age. All of these intersectional dynamics of our identity will be common themes that we'll explore throughout the course of COM 412. So with that said, let me tell you what this class is all about. In this class, we're going to consider how gender is socially constructed and performed or communicated. The class structure is going to be very multi-method. I like using a variety of different teaching methods to keep you engaged in the literature. Sometimes we'll have a traditional lecture. Other times we'll play games like Jeopardy! Sometimes I'll split you into different groups and have you do small group performances and other in-class activities. And obviously, since I won't be here on the first 5 days that we're regularly scheduled to meet in class, there's an online component to the course as well. So you're going to have a bunch of different learning styles and teaching styles to adapt to in the class, but generally, students really appreciate the way that that I teach COM 412. It keeps them on their toes and interested. Other structures of the class. I like to focus on experiential learning, meaning that it's one thing to talk about gender issues in our day-to-day life, but one of the reasons why I like splitting you into small groups and having you construct skits or performances is when you start talking about gender performances and then actually performing some of these issues in your own body through acts of improvisation, it really adds another dimension to our discussion and really gets you talking about the realities of gendered expectations in our day-to-day life. So I'm really big on that. I also encourage critical thinking. The main textbook that we'll be using for the class is the 8th edition of Julia Wood's Gendered Lives. This book is not the Bible. It is not the be-all, end-all of gender interpretation. So if you take issue with something that Julia Wood says in the text, part of critical thinking is mentioning the problems that you have with the textbook. Not only do I allow you to disagree with Julia Wood in the context of the class, or me in my lectures, I encourage you to disagree with me. It shows me that you're engaged in the literature. Now, if you disagree with something, I prefer that you go out and you conduct some research or review some research on the subject matter, so you're showing that your disagreement comes from an informed, researched place. The tests in this course are going to cover everything that we do. So it's not going to be enough just to read the book or to come to class and do the lectures. I could pull test questions from the lectures, from the videos like the one that you're watching now, from in-class activities, you know, from any reading that we do in the class. So it's very important that you stay on your toes.